I suppose I never truly lived until I reached 64. I thought to myself, David, what kept me from living all these years? What if I denied myself? This internal questioning felt both like an accusation and an awakening. Bruce said nothing. He merely observed me, and his gaze gave me the strength I needed. He supported me, not with words or actions, but with the look in his eyes as my fingers gently grasped the straps and pulled them down. "Oh, hello, I didn't see you there," I said, realizing I was speaking aloud. "I was just sharing a little story about what we went through. Let me start over so you can get the full picture of how everything unfolded." At 64, I never expected something as simple as tidying up would lead to such a moment, thanks to my step-grandson showing up unexpectedly. It had been 12 years since my husband David passed, leaving me feeling isolated and widowed for far too long. It was late morning when I finally decided to tackle the one task I'd been putting off for years: cleaning out the basement. That chaotic, forgotten corner of the house that I'd always avoided, its very thought tightening my chest. But that day, I gathered the courage to face it. The dusty room, filled with old boxes and the musty scent of forgotten things, was a relic of a lifetime of memories. The first box I opened contained something I wasn't expecting at all: an old photo album from my younger days. As I flipped through the pages, one photo stood out. It was from a beach party, where I was holding a margarita in one hand, wearing a bright orange bikini, laughing as though I had no worries in the world. A carefree young Elizabeth, full of joy, stared back at me. Looking at that photo, a wave of warmth and sadness washed over me, bringing back long-buried memories, desires, and excitement I had suppressed. Just then, I heard a noise from the basement door. I turned, startled, to see Bruce standing there. It had been 4 years since I'd last seen him, and he looked more grown up now, broader, with that same familiar smile. The last time I saw him, he was 23. Now he must be 27. "Surprise," he said, raising a coffee cup in the air. "When did you get here?" I asked, taken off guard but genuinely happy to see him. "Just now," he replied, walking down the stairs. "I saw your car outside and thought I'd come in. Looks like you could use some help." I was about to say I could manage on my own, but before I could speak, he was already by my side, his face set with determination. His eyes locked on the photo album I was holding. "What's this?" he asked before I could snatch it from his hands. I froze for a moment as his gaze rested on the picture of young Elizabeth on the beach. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity before looking up at me. "Is this you?" he asked. "Yeah," I answered with a nervous laugh. "My wild years back in the day." Bruce's eyes shifted from the photo back to me, his expression filled with a mix of admiration and surprise. It was unsettling, yet somehow warm. "Wow," he said. "It's weird to think of you like this, but impressive." He smiled. "If you're enjoying these little confessions, join me on my channel for more. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because trust me, this story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss it." A flicker of something stirred within me, something I couldn't fully grasp. Feelings I had buried for years, emotions that David had never truly awakened in me, surfaced for just a brief moment. But this wasn't right. It couldn't be. "All right, enough of the trip down memory lane," I said quickly, closing the album. "We need to start hauling these old boxes out of here." But I had no idea where that photo, Bruce's expressions, and the storm brewing inside me would lead. Bruce gently stopped my hands as I tried to close the album. "We really need to look at this," he said, half joking, half serious. "It's unbelievable seeing you so young, vibrant, and different. Come on, let's take a look at a few more." I hesitated for a moment. Not all the pictures in that album were innocent. Beyond those carefree beach photos, there were bolder ones, moments that captured the wilder side of my youth. But seeing Bruce so fascinated, feeling the admiration in his eyes, I couldn't say no. "All right," I said with a small smile, "but some of these might be a bit much." Bruce chuckled and nodded. "I'm sure everything's great," he said, taking the album and sitting down beside me. His breath was close enough that I could feel it brush my skin as we flipped through the pages. The beach party photos gave way to pictures from my college years, nights out in clubs. One photo showed me in a tight, backless red dress, dancing tipsily. Bruce lingered on that one, staring a little too long. "This is really you?" he asked, his eyes shifting between the photo and me, his face lighting up with awe and curiosity. "Yeah," I replied, a little shyly. "It was just youth, you know? Things were different back then." Bruce was silent for a moment before finally speaking. "You're incredible," he said, pausing before adding, "All this time, I've only ever thought of you as my grandmother, but you were like a total, I don't know, a party girl." His words made me blush, but at the same time, they stirred something inside me. I thought about how David had never shown me that kind of admiration, even when I was younger. He had always been distant, cold, and strict. But Bruce, he was different. The look in his eyes spoke volumes. As we continued flipping through the album, the photos became bolder. There was one of me laughing with friends, wearing a short pair of shorts and a bikini top. Another showed me dancing in a nightclub, clad in a plunging black dress. Bruce smiled softly and said, "It's a privilege to see these. Even when you were younger, your beauty was breathtaking." David was one lucky man. His words warmed me, but they also made me feel something else. Something strange. The more I felt Bruce's attention, his interest, the more I realized there was an undeniable pull between us. He was the kind of man I had dreamed of when I was younger. Confident, openly admiring, and eager to discover the parts of me I had kept hidden. When we reached the last page, Bruce closed the album but didn't look away from me. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low, "you're truly extraordinary." I was surprised and moved by his words. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me like that or said things like that to me. As our eyes locked, I felt the air between us thicken, and something shifted. Despite the cold, dusty atmosphere of the basement, warmth spread inside me. Bruce's presence made me feel young again, though I had no idea where these feelings were leading. Bruce closed the album and turned to me, still gazing at me with deep admiration. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice sincere. "After seeing all those pictures, I have to say this. You haven't aged a day. You still look young and absolutely beautiful." The compliment took me by surprise. Even in my youth, I wasn't accustomed to hearing such words, especially not from David. My heart beat a little faster and a warm flush crept onto my cheeks. "Thank you, Bruce," I said, though I knew I couldn't hide the fact that I had aged. Still, maybe I've gotten older, but I haven't lost touch with my desires. I've never let go of them. Bruce smiled, his green eyes unwavering. "I can feel that," he said. "You're not just beautiful. You're absolutely captivating." I couldn't help but glance at his broad, athletic build for a moment. His tall figure, wide shoulders, and slightly wavy blonde hair made him seem like someone straight out of a movie. But what struck me the most was the confident yet gentle look in his green eyes. "It's interesting to hear something like that from someone like you," I said, smiling softly. "David was nothing like you. He was always so composed, so distant. He never did anything to truly surprise or excite me. He was a good man, but—" Bruce tilted his head, listening intently. "But not the kind of man you longed for, right?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, but couldn't look away. "Yeah," I admitted. David was never as exciting or passionate as I had hoped he'd be. I'm not saying he was bad, but something always seemed missing. Bruce was quiet for a moment, then gave me a soft but confident smile. "Maybe it's important for you to realize that," he said. "Maybe now's the time to figure out what fills that void." His words sparked something inside me. The way this young man was paying attention to me, understanding me, and speaking so confidently ignited an excitement I hadn't felt in years. I suddenly realized that Bruce wasn't just different from David. He was also incredibly close to the kind of man I had once dreamed of when I was younger. But I wasn't sure where these feelings would take me or if they were the right direction. After a pause, Bruce stood up, sliding his hands into his pockets, his green eyes locking onto mine again. "I'm going to put the bike in the garage and come right back," he said steadily. "But don't stay in the basement, Elizabeth. Wait for me in the living room." The confidence in his tone and the way he took charge had an unusual effect on me. I nodded slightly, agreeing. "All right, Bruce," I said. Bruce moved upstairs quickly, and as I watched him go, I found myself thinking about how even his love for his motorcycle seemed to affect me. I imagined how he must look working on it or writing it. Energetic, passionate, determined, the exact kind of man I had dreamed of when I was younger. He's so much like the person I always imagined, I murmured to myself. But he's my step-grandson. And yet, right now, he's really having an effect on me. I moved to the living room and waited. It didn't take long before Bruce returned with a bottle of wine. When my eyes caught the label, I instantly recognized it. It was my favorite rosé. I had no idea how he knew or why he thought of it, but once again, I felt a spark inside me. I got this from the best place I could find, he said, smiling faintly. I hope you like it. Like it? I said, surprised. Bruce, this is my favorite wine. How did you know? He shrugged with a look on his face that suggested he didn't want to explain. I noticed little things when I was younger, he said. I guess I remembered. I paused, deeply moved by the fact that this young man had remembered so much about me. Bruce, I said softly, this wine is really special. Thank you. That was so thoughtful. He opened the bottle, poured it into 2 glasses, and handed one to me. Let's share some good memories tonight, Elizabeth, he said. I raised my glass and we toasted. As I took the first sip, the taste of the rosé danced on my tongue. I couldn't help but keep my eyes on Bruce. As the conversation flowed, I found myself drawn to him, not just by his appearance, but also by his thoughts and the way he carried himself. At one point, when our glasses were nearly empty, Bruce's eyes locked onto mine again. There was warmth in his gaze, a pull I couldn't ignore. Inside me, something was shifting, a mix of fear and excitement, but I still had no idea where these feelings were leading me. Suddenly, Bruce paused. He set his glass down on the table, turning his eyes back to me. This time, his gaze was more determined, more intense. Elizabeth, he said, his voice low but full of emotion he couldn't hide. I looked at him and realized my breathing had quickened, my heart pounding in my chest. Yes, Bruce, I whispered, my voice barely audible as if it couldn't manage more. In that moment, Bruce reached for my hand. The warmth of his fingers gently gliding over my delicate hand sent a rush of emotions through me. I know I shouldn't say this, he began, but when I look at you, I can't stop myself. You're not just incredibly beautiful. You're so much more than I ever imagined. His words resonated deeply within me, and I felt my face flush. Bruce! I started, but before I could finish, he hesitated just for a moment before leaning in. My heart felt like it was about to stop. Watching him move closer, I knew I should say no, but I couldn't resist the powerful pull I felt toward him. When his lips touched mine, slow and deliberate, the world seemed to pause for an instant. That kiss was gentle but deep. I felt desires I had buried for years suddenly flood back. His strong hands moved to my waist, and I let myself fully surrender to the moment. When Bruce's lips pulled away, the tension between us hung in the air. My heart was still racing, and I looked at him, hoping my eyes could express what I was feeling. But putting these emotions into words seemed impossible. Driven by an impulse I couldn't ignore, I leaned in and kissed him again. This time, I was the one making the move. As my lips pressed against his again, something inside me came to life. Bruce seemed a little surprised at first, but he quickly responded. Our kiss grew deeper, more passionate, his hand sliding to my waist, pulling me closer with a gentle but firm touch. I could feel his warmth radiating through my entire body. As we lay side by side on the couch, there was almost no space between us. His presence, his breath, everything about him filled the moment completely. Resting against Bruce's chest, a restless feeling stirred inside me. My heart was still racing, but this time it wasn't fear or hesitation. It was a burning desire to let go completely. I slowly sat up, feeling his curious but calm gaze on me. His eyes, so focused and intense, seemed to understand everything happening inside me without needing a word. As I stood up, I hesitated for a moment. My heart pounded, and I let a bold, powerful urge take over. My hands moved to the thin straps of my dress, which had started to feel like chains holding me back. Bruce didn't say anything. He just watched me, and somehow that gave me courage. He supported me, not with his hands, but with his eyes. As my fingers grasped the straps and slowly slid them down, the dress slipped off my shoulders, falling gently to the floor. The fabric pooled around my bare feet like a soft puddle. In that moment, I could finally breathe. It wasn't just a physical act. It felt symbolic, like shedding years of restraint and finally freeing myself. When I turned my gaze back to Bruce, the admiration and awe in his expression were unmistakable. He didn't need to say a word. He understood that this was me breaking through my own limits, accepting myself fully. Bruce slowly stood up and reached his hand toward me. His touch was as tender and strong as always, but this time I wasn't just embracing him. I was embracing all of myself. For 15 minutes, I stayed in that exact position on the couch, barely moving. I was so close to passing out, but somehow I managed to hold on. Maybe it was the years of longing that had built up this strange resilience in me. Bruce's broad, powerful frame had always drawn me in, but now, the intensity of my attraction was on another level. I felt breathless, like I had just left the entire world behind. My heart was racing, my body trembling, and every inch of me felt the impact of his presence. For the first time in my life, I felt physically exhausted in the most exhilarating way. It wasn't a limit, it was liberation. Even as I was lost in these overwhelming emotions, my mind wandered into a strange reflection. I didn't truly live until now, I thought. David, what did he hold me back from all these years? What did I deny myself for so long? This inner questioning felt like both a quiet rebellion and a long overdue awakening. Bruce, still catching his breath, ran a hand through his hair. Seeing that he was just as affected as I was somehow comforted me. He gave a faint smile, fixing his tousled hair, and in a low voice he said, "I'm going to take a shower." In that moment, I felt the sparkle in his eyes, the softness in his voice, and the calm determination behind it all. And just like that, everything became even more real. I watched Bruce walk away, but my mind stayed stuck on what had just happened and the bittersweet joy of discovering myself so late in life. If you've made it this far, I know my story has left an impact on you. There's so much more to share, and you won't want to miss any of it. Make sure to hit that follow button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment about this story. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. So, let's chat in the comments. Your support means the world to me. Some confessions press so hard on your chest that every unsaid word becomes a burden, growing heavier as time goes on. Well, today is the day I share the suffocating feeling I've been carrying. The secret I've kept hidden in my heart. Today I confess it. At 60 years old, something happened that made me feel more alive than I ever have before, and it came at the most unexpected moment. That morning, the hot water in the bathroom stopped working again. The broken faucets and my disrupted routines reminded me how much my life felt like an endless cycle of loneliness, silence, and monotony, especially since my husband passed away. Whenever something needed fixing around the house, I had to call someone. I picked a plumber at random from the phone book. Otis, the young man on the other end, spoke in a deep, steady voice, saying, "I can come by today." There was something in his voice I couldn't quite describe, but it intrigued me. I tried to ignore it since this was just a faucet issue. But when the doorbell rang, everything changed. When I opened the door, the young man standing there was filled with a vitality that instantly banished the dullness of my life. Otis dropped his toolbox from his shoulder onto the floor. "The bathroom is this way?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, then gestured down the hallway. "Yes, just through that door." I led him to the bathroom. His tall, muscular build filled the narrow hallway, and his muscles were visible through the thin shirt he wore. For a moment, I couldn't help but notice, and I realized I hadn't seen a physique like that in years. I couldn't tear my gaze away for a second longer than I intended. Once inside, Otis moved with such assurance that it felt like he wasn't just there to fix the faucet, but to unlock something that had been sealed for years. "Is this the faucet?" he asked, examining the old fixture on the countertop. Yeah," I stammered, feeling nervous for no reason. After all, this was just a repair job, yet my heart seemed to have a different story in mind. Otis bent down, checking the pipes under the sink, and his muscles became even more pronounced under his shirt. Without meaning to, I found myself holding my breath. "It's an old system," he said while inspecting the pipes. But we can fix it. It'll take a few hours. His calm, confident tone caught me off guard. I hadn't interacted with someone so young and self-assured in years. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe something in me was beginning to stir again. I was about to leave the bathroom when Otis turned around, his eyes locking with mine. "Can I grab a towel from over there?" he asked, pointing to a small leak in the bathroom. My hand went to my face, embarrassed. "Of course," I said quickly, moving to open the cabinet. My hands trembled as I pulled out the towel. When I handed it to him, our fingers brushed, and the brief touch sent a wave of sensation through my body. In that instant, I realized this was no longer just about fixing a faucet. That silence between us seemed to hold years of unspoken emotions. "Thanks," he said, returning to his work, but his gaze had unsettled me. I kept wondering, was that just a fleeting moment? Or had this young man awakened something within me that had been dormant for years? As Otis bent over to work, I found myself pacing the bathroom. My hands seemed unsure of what to do. They either tangled in themselves or gripped the counter. The silence was growing suffocating, but what really pressed on me was his presence. I couldn't help but glance at him. His youth, his energy, his focus on his task, they were pulling me in. Something inside me was waking up, something I hadn't felt in years. "I don't meet many young plumbers," I said, realizing it was an odd thing to say. "How long have you been doing this?" Otis glanced over his shoulder, and as soon as our eyes met, warmth flooded through me. He seemed to try not to notice. 5 years, he answered, refocusing on his work. "I started as an apprentice, then went on to run my own business." My curiosity kept growing. "How old are you?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of admiration I couldn't hide. 26, he replied without hesitation. I was surprised at how young he was, but at the same time I felt a flutter inside me. His youth both thrilled and oddly attracted me. "Ah," I said, trying to smile. "If you hadn't told me you were 26, I wouldn't have believed it. You seem older." Otis didn't answer right away, but I noticed a subtle shift in his expression, like I had caught him off guard. After a pause, he went back to his work, his professionalism helping me regain composure, though a flirtatious part of me still lingered. "Would you like some coffee when you're done with the repairs?" I asked, attempting to shift the topic. "I have a great coffee machine. People say my coffee is really good." He hesitated, his shoulders tightening. He glanced at me again, as if calculating something in his mind. "Thanks, but I have more work to do. I'll need to leave as soon as I'm done." I felt a slight disappointment, but clearly Otis was focused on keeping things professional, and maybe that made him even more interesting. He took his work seriously, never letting his professionalism slip even at such a young age. When he finished, I noticed him glancing at me a few times while packing up his toolbox. There was something in those glances: attraction, curiosity, but also hesitation. "All done," he said, lifting his toolbox back onto his shoulder. "The hot water should be working fine now. If there's any issue, just call me." "I will," I replied, gripping the doorframe. "Thanks for fixing it so quickly. I guess that's the advantage of youth." This time, he gave a slight smile, but still kept his professional demeanor. He walked toward the door, paused for a second like he wanted to say something, but then just nodded at me and left. It felt like a connection had formed between us. Something that shouldn't have happened, but I couldn't tell where it was headed. All I knew was that, for the first time in a long time, my heart was beating faster. The next morning, when I went into the bathroom to shower, I noticed the faucet was still only giving cold water. I don't think I've ever been so happy about a malfunction before. My hands shook as I found Otis's number in my contacts and called him. My heart raced as the phone rang. "Hey, Otis," I said, adding a bit of urgency to my voice. "I think the faucet you fixed yesterday is acting up again. I'm really sorry, but could you come back?" His voice, as professional as always, hesitated for a moment. "Sure. I'll bring some spare parts with me so we can fix it for good. I'll be there in about an hour." I thanked him, and as I hung up, an odd excitement washed over me. This time I wanted to be prepared, but at the same time I wanted to seem unprepared. Carefree. While rummaging through my wardrobe, I grabbed my favorite black lace nightgown. It was just something comfortable, I told myself. But I knew I was lying. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath and opened the door. Otis's eyes swept over me for a brief moment before he quickly composed himself. He had his tool bag and a few pipe pieces with him. "Hey," I said, acting as if my outfit was completely normal. "I hope I'm not bothering you too much. This faucet is driving me crazy." Otis avoided my gaze and headed for the bathroom door. "No problem," he said. "I'll fix it for good this time." I followed him into the bathroom as he bent down to work. I noticed every movement of his body. His hands were quick and precise, but he seemed a bit tense. "Does this happen often?" I asked, trying to break the silence. The thin fabric of my nightgown brushed against my skin, making me feel even bolder. "I mean, do the things you fix ever break again?" Otis didn't look up. "Sometimes," he said, "but this time I'm sure it'll be fine. I have every part I might need." "How careful you are," I said, giving him a slight smile. "You must be really good at your job, even for someone so young." While reaching for the faucet, I accidentally brushed my hand lightly against his arm. Otis froze for a moment, but then returned to his work. He didn't look at me, but I could feel his tension. "I'm just trying to do my job," he said finally, his tone a bit softer. A silence followed, and his distant demeanor only made me bolder. As he leaned over to inspect a pipe under the faucet, I gently touched his back with my hand. "It's tough to find someone as good at this as you," I remarked, using a lightly playful tone this time. Otis straightened up and met my gaze. There was something in his eyes. Uncertainty, tension, and an effort to maintain control. "Sarah," he said, saying my name as if trying to draw boundaries. "I'm almost done. After this, I won't bother you anymore." But the sharpness in his voice seemed to break for a brief moment. Watching him try to escape the situation stirred something in me. An excitement, a desire I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know how much longer this tension could hold, but we were at a breaking point, and who would cross the line was up to us. As Otis bent down to work on the faucet, I leaned against the nearby cabinet, watching him intently. The thin fabric of my nightgown clung to my body more with each movement I made, creating a provocative stance. Otis pretended not to notice, but I saw the slight tremble in his hands. The tremor told me that he wasn't resisting me. He was fighting himself. "Are you sure you know exactly what you're doing?" I asked, adding a teasing tone to my voice. Otis didn't look up as he continued working, but his breathing quickened. "Of course," he replied shortly. "It's easy." "Really?" I asked, stepping a little closer. "Then why does it break every few days?" I bent down to grab a towel from the cabinet, and as I did, the thin strap of my nightgown slipped off my shoulder. The feeling of wearing it gave me more courage. When Otis looked up, his eyes lingered for a moment before he quickly turned back to his work. But this time, his movements sped up, as if he wanted to finish quickly. "Maybe something else in the bathroom is causing the problem," he suggested, tightening the faucet, but his voice cracked slightly, trying to sound firm. "Maybe," I said, leaning back against the cabinet. "Or maybe the problem is not finding the right touch." I let the words hang in the air. The silence thickened, and the tension in the small bathroom became almost unbearable. Otis stayed quiet for a moment before he put his tools down and stood up. His movements were slow, but his face showed inner conflict. On one side, control, and on the other, a desire he was trying to suppress. I got even closer to him, and now the space between us was only inches. I could hear his breath. "Otis," I whispered. But before I could finish, his hands were on my waist. His lips were filled with increasing tension, and the trembling in his body showed that something was about to change quickly. The silence was broken by only our breathing and heartbeats, and in that moment, everything collided. "We shouldn't do this," he said, but his voice was weak, full of helplessness. "Really?" I asked, getting closer to him. "Are you sure?" In that instant, he hesitated as if he couldn't take it anymore, and then unexpectedly kissed me. Our kiss started slow and uncertain, but soon the passion between us ignited. With our eyes closed, we locked into each other, and Otis pulled me closer. We moved toward the bedroom, bumping into walls as we went. Our hands tangled together and our hearts raced. In a moment of wildness, everything seemed to change. By the time we reached the bedroom, Otis had a firm grip on my waist, and without resisting, I quickened my steps. Everything happened so quickly that I barely realized we were already caught in a physical pull. My mind was still processing everything while my body had already surrendered to him. It was both a mistake and something irreversible. When we got to the bedroom, everything suddenly unraveled. Otis's t-shirt was in the bathroom and his pants were on the floor by the bed. My nightgown had been dragged down the hallway across the carpet. It was all a mess, yet neither of us could calm down. We lay on the bed, still touching, every breath sinking. Everything had happened so fast that for a moment it felt as if time had stopped. I couldn't describe what I felt. It was as though I was lost in a sea of emotions. Otis's strong arms were around me. My eyes were closed, but somehow I could still hear everything. "Can you breathe?" I asked with a slight smile, resting my head on his chest, my hands still on his body. I could feel every movement. "Yes," Otis replied, his voice trembling, slow but steady. "Yes, but I've never felt anything like this before." There was silence for a few seconds, then Otis's breathing sped up and I couldn't ignore it. "Really?" I asked, my lips still warmer than his. "So what do we do now?" "I don't know," he said, running his hands through my hair. "But I guess everything is as complicated as it is, right?" He paused. "But one thing's for sure. Having you with me right now is more than anything else." For a moment, I lost track of time. Everything in my mind blurred. I was simply enjoying the moment. But then clarity returned, and I wondered if this was truly a moment of madness or something deeper. "How do we explain this?" I asked with a slight smile. Otis looked at me for a moment, indecision in his eyes, but also deep desire. "I don't think we need to explain it," he said slowly. "Sometimes things don't need an explanation." We lay together on the bed, our breaths mingling, caught in the magic of the moment. But one question still lingered in my mind. Was this just a moment of madness, or the start of something else? Looking slowly into Otis's eyes, I asked, "How does this end, Otis?" "Haven't you thought about it?" Otis thought for a moment, then took a deep breath. "We'll think about it later," he said, running his hands through my hair. "Right now, let's just enjoy this moment." The emotions inside me shifted in a complex way. But one thing was clear. That moment was beyond everything. This night, this moment would be ours alone. And no matter what happened, it would remain unforgettable. Then there was silence. But this silence was an opportunity to reflect on more than the past, more than the future, more than everything. If you've made it this far, I know you're hooked on the story. There's so much more to share, and you won't want to miss any of it. Don't forget to hit the follow button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, so let's chat in the comments.